My friend and I just started a new channel, to BMW and Mini Techs, and we're both master techs for BMW and Mini. And our first video is going to be replacing brake pads and front rotors, pads and rotors on an E36. And we're going to go through all the steps that you're going to need to do these installs. We're going to do the rear brakes as a separate video and the front brakes as a separate video. We're going to start with the fronts. So we have our brake pads here. The first thing that I want to go over is, of course, just taking the wheel off. And of course, I do have air, so it does make things a little bit easier. And for the lift point, you want to look for this location right here, this circle. And right below that should be the lifting point, where on most vehicles there's a lift pad. It is missing on this vehicle, but it's no big deal. You still want to lift it at the same spot. And then just go ahead and slide this underneath. And go ahead and start lifting it up. Actually, if you want to do that for me.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm the other tech here, and just wanted to make note, anytime you are jacking up a vehicle, that you always secure the opposite axle of wheel so that it doesn't roll away on you. Right now we're just using a rock on the back side of this rear wheel. And we're off the ground.
If you don't have shop air or tools or a compressor, you're going to want to leave the tire on the ground and break all your lugs free before lifting it up, and then just use the socket to remove the lugs. You're going to need a 17 millimeter. We're going to go ahead and zip this wheel off.
Help if it didn't get stuck. Or it just, got stuck.
Actually, a neat trick to prevent that, if you do have a little bit of rust, is actually lube up the socket before you start taking the lugs off, and the socket does come off a little bit easier. You could actually just use some copper anti-seize on the inside of the socket. Let's just take a peek here. He's got a few millimeters left on the front pads. You can see right there. The inside's worn more than the outside. He's getting a vibration, and basically when braking, the steering wheel's shaking. So we have some warped rotors. Looks like the contact pattern is a little funny. You can see right here it's actually wearing more than up here. So there's probably a hard spot in this pad, and it's causing a warpage of this rotor. So we're going to have to replace both pads and rotors to correct this. Here's our set screw, which we'll have to remove. Here's our retaining clip, and then we're going to remove the caliper and the rotor for this repair.
Okay, and doing some preparation work. We have one set of pads here for the front. You definitely want to make sure you put the proper lubricant on the pads to make sure the pads slide freely in the caliper so they don't bind. So we're just going to go ahead and take your basic anti-seize lubricant, copper based, and lubricate the contact points of the pads.
Also, lubricating the back of the pad reduces the noise that's going to occur from the vibration when braking, which actually creates the brake squeak. It's going to absorb the oscillation. Make sure to hit the sides like we're showing you here. That's the sliding surface, and the back. And you never want to get any kind of contamination on the friction surface, because that would compromise the pad. If you actually get any oil on this friction surface or grease, you do need to discard it and get a new set of pads.
And sometimes it helps to lubricate this little spring here, as that's going to sit inside the piston. it'll just help it slide into the piston a little better when you put that pad on. Okay, prep work for the rotors. Usually your aftermarket rotors that you buy will come in a plastic bag, and the rotors are covered in an oil to prevent corrosion. Now, as we stated with the pads, you don't want to get oil on your pads or you're going to have contaminated pads. So the best way to remove the oil is to get a shop rag and use some brake parts cleaner. Spray it on the rag like so and just kind of wipe it off on both sides of the contact surface of the rotor. Go right around it like that, and flip it over and do the other side, just to remove all the oil from those, because you don't want that on your pads at all.
Now, it's not a big deal if you have the oil on the hub portion, which is here. It's really the friction surface that you have to be most concerned with. Now, make sure to have a jack stand when you have your vehicle jacked up for safety purposes, because you can never trust the hydraulics. We're going to go ahead and turn the steering wheel. We only have one wheel up off the ground, and that's going to make it easier to access the bolts in the caliper.
First thing you want to do when starting to get these brakes off is to loosen the rotor bolt. And the best way to do that is to take a screwdriver and stick it between the cooling fins in the rotor so that the rotor doesn't turn. Then this is a 6mm Allen, sits right in there, and then you just stick your wrench in there, and with a couple of good whacks, usually that'll come free, and then that'll be out of your way and the rotor should come off. Then you can take, I usually use a pry bar. It doesn't take a pry bar, but just to pop these little plastic caps off where the caliper sliders are. There's usually one on the top, one on the bottom. Of course I can't see it. There we go. Then you take this same pry bar, and there's a retaining spring here that if you just pry against the rotor, it'll release the little hooks in the holes here, and sometimes it'll fly off, sometimes you might have to work at it to get it off, but that has to come off. Lastly, you want to stick it between the rotor here and the caliper so you can press this piston back in order to get the new pads on eventually. I usually try to bring it out as far as possible to get that piston in, and sometimes you kind of work it against the rotor, between the pad and the rotor, so you get the most out of your pulling, and then you can access the fasteners easier on this side. Okay, after you've pressed out your caliper so the piston's all the way inside the caliper, you want to access your fasteners here. Most of your BMWs, this is a 7mm Allen, which I have a stubby one here. Just fit it right in the slider, and again, you want to loosen that up. So it comes all the way out on the top, and the same goes on the bottom. Sometimes you get lucky and you can finish spinning it out with just the socket, but not here. All the way out. Not yet. And you just kind of wiggle it out. And there's your caliper. And you can just press the old pad out of the piston like so, and a lot of times the outside pad will just fall off like it just did. Okay, once you get the caliper out of the way and the pad's off, you work on these two bolts here that hold the carrier plate or torque plate for the pads, because you have to take this off in order to get the rotor off. This is a 16 millimeter bolt on this particular car, which usually is the case on most BMWs. Sometimes they're 18. And again, sometimes you get it to a point where you can finish taking it out with your fingers. Obviously, if you had an air ratchet, this would be a lot faster. But in this case, this is working quite well.
Looks like the rotor's falling right off for you too.
Absolutely.
Which sometimes your rotor's going to be stuck on, and you want to show them the surface that you want to hit around to work your rotor off with a hammer. If it is stuck, would be just to hit around this surface here. You know, if you are going to reuse a rotor, you don't want to hit any of this surface here because you're going to warp it. But if you tap around this area here, a lot of times you can actually break it free. Now, if your rotor is garbage, you can go ahead and give it a good solid whack, spin it, hit it again from the backside. It really does a good job popping this off.
Okay, after you get the rotor off and all the brake hardware off, you always want to clean the mounting surface where the new rotor is going to be with a wire brush. Just so that you have a nice even surface to mount the new rotor to prevent warping. Because if it's not even, you run the risk of warping the rotor at some point. So it's always a good idea to clean it. Now for mounting the new rotor, make sure you line up the rotor mounting bolt hole with the hole on the hub here. And you'll know it when the rest of your holes line up with the holes that are going to mount your wheel. So usually I just put the rotor mounting bolt in and just snug it up a little bit so the rotor stays in place. Then you take your wire brush again. Some people like to clean the plate that holds the pads in place with a wire brush. Make sure you have a nice clean surface for the new pads when you put them on. And then slide that on and start your bolts. And once you get them in place, make sure you tighten them up. Get them good and snug. Now, you want to make sure your piston is all the way into the caliper from before. So take your pair of channel locks and put the used brake pad over the piston, and use the brake pad to hold the piston and compress it so that it's all the way until it stops.
It's a neat trick using the old brake pad.
And then you position the new brake pads, one in the brake pad plate on the outside, and then the other one snaps into the piston, which is where I lubricated it before, so it snaps in a little easier, like so. And you slide the whole assembly into the other torque plate and over the other brake pad, and then slide your two sliders in. Now, a good idea with the sliders, make sure they move freely. You don't want them to bind up and interfere with your brake pad operation or your braking operations. So you might want to just take them out and take a good look at them, make sure they're good. I would avoid trying to use grease to make, and see, if you look here, you've got a little corrosion, so you probably want to clean that up with a wire brush for sure on both sides. Clean your pins up as best as you can with a wire brush, and just apply a little bit of anti-seize to those to help make sure they don't bind up in that caliper and cause sticking. You only have to put a little bit because you're going to turn them in and it's going to spread it around pretty evenly. Give that a good snug. Like so. Make sure you put your dust caps back in place after you've snugged up the sliders. And then grab your retaining spring and make sure the tabs are on the outside of the bracket here. And then you push in with both thumbs till those hooks go right in the holes on the caliper and it snaps into place. Then after you've got all that together, put your screwdriver back in the cooling vents to snug up your rotor bolt. Like so.